This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Okay, that was from the film Fundi, the story of Ella Baker. And it's a real pleasure for me to talk about Ella Baker because unlike some of the other people who I admire from the historical distance as a scholar, people like Du Bois and Paul Robeson and the others I've talked about so far in this course, Ella Baker is someone who I not only admired but got to know, and I think if anyone had any more direct influence on me, I don't know who that would be, maybe Bob Moses, but Bob Moses himself was inspired by Ella Baker. The birthday party that starts this film, it's her 75th birthday party. It took place in New York. I was very privileged to be there. It was an event that brought me in touch with lots of different aspects of the radical tradition in this country, because the people gathered there to celebrate Ella Baker's 75th birthday represented the 1930s and the radicalism of the Depression era, represented the 1940s and the emergence of the NAACP as a mass-based organization, and of course the split between that and the more leftist-oriented activism of that decade. She certainly represented the 1950s with the Montgomery bus boycott and her role in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the 1960s with her role as being the stimulus for the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was the one who recognized the unique potential of black students to be the spearhead of the movement. She wanted them to be independent and fought for that independence and influenced during the 1960s a whole generation of young activists. And when I interviewed her in the 1970s, she was still active. She was, of course, doing less during that time, but because of her age, but she was still very much involved in many movements. I remember going to her apartment in New York, and I could tell that she was very tired and had been a long day, and she had a lot of problems on her mind, personal problems. But once we began talking, you could see that energy coming back, and she wanted to convey the story. And later on with Awele, I wanted to read some passages from that interview I did in the 1970s. But let me say a few words about Ella Baker's background. She was born in the South in Norfolk, Virginia, but as a young child, her parents took her to Littleton, North Carolina. And she grew up in a small farming community established soon after the Civil War by her mother's father, a man by the name of Mitchell Ross, who had acquired part of what had been a plantation. And through land ownership, he was able to build an independent black community. One of the things that historians are just beginning to study is the way in which after the Civil War, there were lots of different experiences, but in Mississippi, Alabama, and other places in the South, especially the Sea Islands area, there were black people who were able to get pieces of land and with great effort held on to these pieces and built independent black towns, independent black communities, some of which existed well into the 20th century. Her grandfather imbued her with a sense of racial pride and also a kind of leadership that was not necessarily hierarchical, but one that was integrated well into the community. He was she called him a teacher type of clergyman who was not trained in the ministry, but emerged as a leader in the local church. And she saw many examples during her childhood, and she talked about this later, of black people helping each other, sharing food, sharing the ability to farm. And she said the sense of the community was pervasive in the black community as a whole, and the community had a sense of their own roots. Her mother stressed the value of education, and she sent her off to attend high school at what was then Shaw College in Raleigh, North Carolina. And as many colleges and universities of that time, they had high schools attached to them because they understood that many black students came without the training necessary to go to college, so that this was kind of an extension of college. And eventually she did get her undergraduate degree there. And she began to think about becoming perhaps a medical missionary, or maybe going to the University of Chicago to study sociology. But she did have this one major problem. She didn't have any money. And instead, she decided that she was going to join the migration to New York during the 1920s. She had heard about the Harlem Renaissance, wanted to be part of that excitement, arrived in New York in 1927, one of the many migrants during that decade. And of course, 1927, as you know, was just 2 years before the onset of the stock market crash and the subsequent onset of the Depression. So there were few employment opportunities there. But Ella Baker, in her own description, found that the New York environment was so exciting. She wanted to learn more about different things, particularly the political life. She was exposed to black nationalism. She was exposed to the Communist Party, various socialist movements. And she said, we had a lovely time. The ignorant ones, like me, we had lots of opportunity to hear and to evaluate whether this was the kind of thing you wanted to do in terms of politics. In 1930, she found a movement that she could really identify with. And it had been started by George Schuyler, a newspaper columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier. Now, Schuyler has a long career, a very controversial career. He later becomes a real critic of certain kinds of black militancy. But in the early 1930s, he helps to form a group called the Young Negroes Cooperative League. He puts forward the idea that the way to deal with the problems of the black community, especially the economic problems, is to form cooperatives. And Ella Baker was one of his first proteges. She really latched onto this notion. It fit with what she had learned growing up in the South, in a small farming community. And she understood that black people had to do something on their own to try to come together to solve the problems of the Depression. And she became the first national director of this new organization. Her salary was $10 a week, and she took it upon herself to try to bring this idea of cooperatives to other black people. One of the ways in which I could describe the cooperative movement is a statement I found by George Schuyler. And he said, "Cooperative democracy means a social order in which mills, mines, railroads, farms, markets, houses, shops, and all the other necessary means of production, distribution, and exchange are owned cooperatively by those who produce, operate, and use them. Whereas the socialists hope to usher in such a utopian society by the ballot, and the communists hope to turn the trick with a bullet, the cooperator, who is really an anarchist, since the triumph of his society will do away with the state in its present form, and I am an anarchist, is slowly and methodically doing so through legal, intelligent, economic cooperation or mutual aid. So you can see that he had a very radical vision of a different kind of society. And this, I think, vision affected Ella Baker for the rest of her life and served as a way of guiding her to the notion of decentralization, getting away from a hierarchical leadership, grassroots activism. During the rest of the 1930s, she first was a critic of the New Deal, but increasingly, especially during Roosevelt's second term, when he became more and more concerned about social issues, began to be involved with the New Deal, eventually getting a New Deal job going around Harlem, helping to set up consumer cooperatives. One of them I found out later. I did a long interview with Bob Moses and tried to find out, how he got involved. And he told me the story about when he was growing up in Harlem, in a Harlem housing project. There was a milk cooperative, and all the people in the housing project pooled their money, and they would go out and buy milk at wholesale prices. And one of his jobs as a young boy actually, was to take the milk around to the various places people who were part of the cooperative. And so instead of getting milk for whatever amount you got it for a lesser price if you joined the cooperative. It turned out that Ella Baker had formed this cooperative. And he thought it was an interesting story because it kind of showed the way in which people who do organizing often have no idea about the end result of that organizing. That she couldn't have known that a young guy, Bob Moses, was in this housing project and who would later take some of these ideas and it would feed into his own notion of what organizing was all about. In the early 1940s, she began a long association with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, becoming its director of branches. And this was the job of going around trying to build up the membership of the NAACP. Now, remember who else did I mention had a similar job? But Shirley Graham, remember, she also came into the NAACP about the same time. And it was during this World War II period that the NAACP vastly expanded its membership. And Ella Baker was largely responsible for that. Shirley Graham didn't last very long. I mean, she was a very effective organizer, but you can kind of get some idea from the lecture I gave on her that she was difficult to fit into a structure like the NAACP. She had joined the Communist Party even before she went to work for the NAACP. With Ella Baker, she also had a difficult time fitting in. She talked about later about her relationship with, by that time Du Bois is gone, but Walter White is still the man in charge of the NAACP. And he had definitely a hierarchical notion of how the NAACP should be formed. One of the things that she remembered about him is his tendency to always be talking about his connections at the White House, his notion about what his job was to lobby in Washington. And the role of the membership of the NAACP was to send their dues so that the national office of the NAACP would have more resources at its disposal. Well, clearly, I think from Ella Baker's point of view, she saw the membership in NAACP branches as being the strength of the organization and an untapped strength. Because why not have these branches more activists on the local level, dealing with local concerns? So there was this tension between Ella Baker and the national leadership. In terms of her notion about activism, she was closer to the left of the 1940s. People like Robeson and others who were saying, you need to go out, mobilize people, have protest activity. But at that time, the NAACP, because they saw it as connected with the left, they didn't want to have anything to do with that. For them, it was counterproductive. If you're going to emphasize litigation, you do not want people out in the streets. If you're going to emphasize lobbying, you do not want people out in the streets. Why? Because that's going to make the job of the lobbyist or the litigator even more difficult, because it brings an unpredictable element into the process of social change. You can't control it once you've let it go. And part of the NAACP's subsequent purge of communists from its ranks was that sense that if you have activism, you're very likely to have leftist activism. If you have leftists in the organization, you're very likely to have protest activity. So the better way is to purge them all from the membership, and that's what the NAACP did. At the end of World War II, Ella Baker herself left the NAACP, and there's always been a lot of discussion. Was she fired? Was she pushed out? What did she decide to leave? She decided to leave voluntarily, knowing that there wouldn't be a lot of objections to her leaving. By that time, she recognized that she had accomplished about as much as she could during that time and wanted to move on to other. She stayed within the NAACP, actually working with the New York branch of the NAACP. And at the time of the Brown decision in 1954, she was working on lots of different local issues having to do with segregation in the North, better schools, housing issues, employment issues, all the various things that affected the North, but working in the context of a very large local branch. So this was the situation on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycott. So you can imagine a woman with Ella Baker's background. She's looking at what's going on in Montgomery. And what is the first thing that she might notice in terms of her own organization, the NAACP? Who are the people playing key roles in the Montgomery bus boycott?
Wasn't one of them the former president of the Alabama State Conference?
Okay, who was that? E.D. Nixon? Okay, E.D. Nixon, NAACP person. Martin Luther King, NAACP person. Who else? Rosa Parks, branch secretary of the NAACP, longtime member of the local branch. So from her perspective, what's going on in Montgomery is an expression of what she's always wanted from the branches. Here you have a branch that's not doing it as the NAACP. They formed this other group called the Montgomery Improvement Association, but in reality, most of the people active in the MIA are members of the local branch of the NAACP. And almost from the beginning, Ella Baker senses that this is something new, this is something important, this is going to really change the equation with respect to black social change. Now, as the NAACP, or the MIA in Montgomery began to have success, she helped form a group, a support organization in New York called In Friendship. And this organization was designed to support what was going on in the South, financially, primarily, some guidance. The people involved in this were Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, and another man by the name of Stanley Levison. And the three of them formed this organization, and they immediately began organizing fundraising events, began encouraging King to form a regional organization. By the end of the night of the boycott in 1956, Stanley Levison and Bayard Rustin go down to Montgomery and talk to King about forming a regional organization. Rustin actually develops the plan for this regional organization. Stanley Levison, a few words about him, his background. He had been a member of the Communist Party during the 1940s. According to the FBI, he never really leaves the party. According to his own account, he left the party and began to devote himself to the cause of civil rights. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think there's a lot of emphasis on whether or not you have a membership card or not. I don't know if a lot of people who worked with the party had membership cards, but in any case, he stayed close to that circle, but he also, I think he made a strategic decision that much more was going to be accomplished in the 1950s through civil rights activism than through a communist party that had been really decimated by the Cold War and McCarthyism. So it's these three who began to work with King to form this regional organization. It's interesting that the two men were the ones who came down to Montgomery, and when they started discussing, well, who is actually going to pull all of this together? Guess what they did? They suggested the woman who was not there as the person who would be best prepared to come south to Atlanta. And when they got back to New York, they went and talked to Ella Baker and said, guess what? We just suggested that you would be a great person to go to Atlanta and work with Martin Luther King and help him set up the headquarters for this new organization, which becomes the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Now, the formation of the SCLC and Ella Baker's role in it, there's been a lot of discussion about that because it's quite clear that at a certain point, and maybe it starts almost immediately, maybe it develops over time, Ella Baker begins to have some doubts about Martin Luther King. And some of you have kind of got that in terms of the readings. What were some of her concerns about King? Have some idea? Yes?
He's too top-down. He's too hierarchical.
Okay, well, what's wrong with that? Isn't this SCLC? Isn't he the president of SCLC? Why shouldn't it be kind of top-down? What would be the problem? Yes?
His methodology was too progressive. Like the changes that she wanted didn't come quick enough, or weren't coming quick enough.
What did she want? What did she want SCLC to do that King wouldn't do?
Demonstrate, like publicly, like to take part in the city and to take part in the grassroots.
Okay, this is late 50s. There are no sit-ins yet.
Okay.
So what does she want to happen? Well, she does want activism at the local level. She sees, here you have the Montgomery bus boycott. And when we think back, it's a bus boycott. It's not, there are mass rallies and things like that, but it's not civil disobedience. It's not mass marches. It's not these kinds of active protests. It's the beginning of that. But even helping spread that idea, the idea of boycotts around the South, she wants to see mobilization at the grassroots level. What does King want? Doesn't he want that? Isn't he a Gandhian who wants kind of mass civil disobedience? Yeah, what is King's idea? Why would he have a problem? Why wouldn't he say to Ella Baker, okay, let's go for it. Let's mobilize the masses. Any idea? Why would there be an argument between? I'll put it this way. If I asked on the midterm, why was there an argument between these two over the question of tactics and strategy? What would King's perspective be? What did he see as the first priority? What did he say? Does anyone recall anything about what he said at the first March on Washington, 1957? They go to on the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. There's a mass rally at the Lincoln Memorial. Yes.
We did discuss about the voting rights and the voting against the political.
Okay. He gives a speech called "Give Us the Ballot." What does he say in that speech? Anyone have any? There's a little bit about that, maybe in the text. Okay, what he's getting across there is give us the ballot, and then we'll take the ballot and political power and do these other things. So if you can register black voters throughout the South, we won't have to appeal to Congress, because Congress will be different. If black people are voting in the South, you won't have conservative Democratic committee chairmen holding up civil rights legislation. If black people are voting, we can help implement the Brown decision. So he sees voter registration as being the key. Now, why, from Ella Baker's point of view, why isn't that enough? Why? Yes.
I guess it wouldn't really change. Like, even if they have the right to vote, it doesn't necessarily equal change.
Right. Yeah, she would probably say, look, I'm not against voter registration. Let's try to do that. And there was a major push to register black voters through the late 1950s, and the NAACP was certainly involved in that. But she still feels that you need to do something to really get people mobilized, and that especially protest activity is going to be an important aspect of the movement. Okay, so you can imagine someone like an Ella Baker getting to the point she wakes up February 1st, 1960, sees in the newspaper something going on. Greensboro, North Carolina. Sit-in. And what happens with that sit-in? The first day, 4 students in Greensboro come in to the Woolworth's lunch counter. And it's about closing time, and they demand to be served. And they are refused service. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't even know what they're doing. We use the term sit-in now, but they didn't know what they didn't know that they were doing a sit-in. I've interviewed them, and they were just like, we were just sitting around BSing in the dorm at night about this terrible situation where we can go into the Woolworth store and we can buy our school supplies, but we can't even sit down and have a hamburger. And so, in fact, David Richmond, I remember having an interview with him, and he said, it wasn't any tactic. We had never even heard of the sit-downs. People said that they took the tactic from the labor strikes of the 1930s. We just thought, let's just go in and see what happens if we just ask for service, and we're just going to find out what's going to happen. And he said that after a while we got so tired of talking about it that one of us just said, look, let's just do it. Let's just go in, ask for service, sit down, don't know what the outcome is going to be. And they didn't, perhaps because of this, the people who managed the store didn't know what to do either. The manager actually didn't want to arrest them. Why? Because a lot of their business was black. So if they create an incident, that's going to maybe lead to black people not wanting to shop there. So he was uncertain. They were uncertain. They just kind of sat there, and then it became closing time at 5:30. They went back to the campus and started talking to their friends and said, guess what we did today? We went in and we sat there and they didn't know what to do. Next day, 20 students go in. Same thing happens. Uncertainty on both sides. Following day, 60 students go in. By this time, it's beginning to get into the local paper, beginning to get covered in the radio. And you can imagine if you're a student, this is in Greensboro, you're a student in Raleigh, and you hear, oh my gosh, students at North Carolina A&T, they went in and sat in. Why don't we do it? So very quickly this idea spreads. Ella Baker, she sees this phenomenon happening. And her first response is, we've got to do something to bring these students together. And that becomes the basis of the meeting in Raleigh that leads to the formation of SNCC, is that it was simply, and look at the name, Coordinating Committee. It wasn't meant to be a bureaucratic organization. It was simply meant to be, you get some leaders from Raleigh, together leaders from Durham, leaders from Greensboro, maybe some from Nashville later on, Atlanta later on. Get them all together, and maybe they can exchange some ideas. We tried this here, maybe you could try that there. And that becomes the basis of SNCC. Now during this time, she also is concerned about, and you get this in the Struggle book, about the older organizations capturing this new movement. Because she doesn't want this to be the youth arm. Many of these students were in the youth arm of the NAACP. She doesn't want that. She doesn't want them to be part of NAACP or part of SCLC or part of the Congress of Racial Equality. She feels that they should have their own independence. Now at this point I wanted to have Awele come and I'll set this up by saying this is part of an interview that I did in the 1972. And I went to New York to interview Ella and talk to her about her role. And I think from this interview you can get some sense, here's a woman looking back over her career. I actually have a picture of her during this time, and unfortunately I wasn't able to get it ready for class. I think I have it someplace in here. But in any case, it was a, no I don't. She was sitting in a robe, and you could kind of tell that she hadn't been out for a while. And she was a person who was just, I think, at a point in her life where she was wondering whether everything was worthwhile. She was poor because she didn't have a regular job. Her job had been being an activist all of her life. And there's no retirement fund for former activists. And I found, though, that the fire was still there. And I asked her, do you want to? I asked her, do you recall any specific examples of student activism during the 1950s?
No, student activism was not a force in the 50s. In fact, the thing I remember most is the characterization of the students of the 50s as the silent generation. And to some extent, that's understandable, because they have been the eras of the McCarthy period, which had silenced large numbers of activists, especially the more radical, and the more radical movements had been driven underground. And so I don't recall much student activity per se, but young people were involved in such things as the work of the NAACP and equalization of teachers' salaries. One of the first persons to test it was a young woman in Norfolk, Virginia, and then there were others in different parts of the country.
And I asked her later on in the interview about the formation of SNCC. And she became the advisor for this new organization, and I think a person, probably the one person over 30 that they did trust and did feel that whose advice they were willing to follow. And I said, what advice did you give during this period? What was your hope?
Well, my basic hope from the beginning was that it would be an independent organization of young people. I thought they had the right to direct their own affairs and even make their own mistakes. You see, I've been around long enough, and I suppose seen enough of what can take place. How people and their ideas can be captured by those who have programs of their own and who may not be as sensitive as they should be to what the other group that they are trying to capture is trying to do. And I've always had great respect for people and for ideas and for the rights of young people to have their chance to make their one mistakes and develop. And so when they meet in Raleigh, there was an effort, as I said, to capture, and I refused to be party to the effort. I also took a position of not permitting the press in on the policy-making meetings. I perhaps could have been in a position to dictate this because I happened to have been the person coordinating it, but I didn't have to do that because the justification of the position taken, namely that rights of the group to make its own decisions and to determine where it wanted to go, it was part of the inner thinking of the young people themselves. And so they were handling that. Out of that meeting, you had a very strong sense of direction in terms of identification. Certainly out of the meetings that took place between April and October, there was more that came to the surface to show that if they wished to survive and do what they thought was important, they had to maintain an independent existence as against being a part of any other organizations.
Thank you. Well, what happened with Ella Baker and SNCC, I think, is that she was the person who kind of kept the organization together. There was always this sense with SNCC that it was about to come apart because there were many different interests. The students were involved primarily in their local movements. Why would they spend time coming to these meetings and sharing thoughts and sharing ideas? Well, I think she understood from the very beginning that these students at the local level, these were organizers. These were people who had the capacity for leadership. They might be only 18, 19, 20 years old, but these were precisely the kind of people that she felt could play a spearhead role in the movement. Now, from the readings, you understand that SNCC went through some difficult transitions during its first year. That notion of being simply a coordinating body was itself a limitation. And by 1961, things had begun to change, and that became too restrictive. So what happens between the time of the Raleigh Conference in April of 1960 and by the fall of 1961, a number of events happened that I think changed the nature of SNCC. Let's find out what were those? What were crucial? Yes?
Freedom rights?
Okay, the freedom rights. Why are the freedom rights crucial? What happens with the freedom rights that change the nature of the organization? Yes.
They got more support from white people, especially like white Northerners.
Okay, the freedom rides bring eventually, although at first they're primarily either core is the first one, but as they go into Mississippi, you increasingly get student activists from the South, but also some from the North begin to participate. What else? Yes.
It's a very student-led movement. King isn't really involved. He doesn't go on a freedom ride. NAACP is not involved. It's basically just...
Okay, particularly after the first freedom ride, which is sponsored by the Congress of Racial Equality, they meet with violence in Alabama, Anniston, Birmingham, Montgomery. They run into violence. And CORE basically says, look, this is, we've kind of tested whether these desegregation orders of the court will be enforced in the South, and we've decided, no, they're not going to be enforced. We're going to be left to mob violence. So they're ready to give up. So at that point, Diane Nash, this is where she plays a crucial role as a leader of the Nashville movement. She says, look, you know, if the freedom rides fail, if the freedom rides are allowed to be crushed by violence, what message is that going to send through the South? If we allow this movement to be crushed by mob violence, then we might as well give it up. So they decide they need to continue the freedom rides into Mississippi. And it becomes a student-led movement. The Freedom Ride Coordinating Committee is formed, kind of like SNCC. Okay, what else happens that's going to change the nature of SNCC? What is SNCC at this point? Going in, it's basically a coordinating committee, right? Does it remain basically a coordinating committee? What happens? Okay, there's a lot of tension during the summer of 1961 about going in two different directions. On the one hand, you have people who say, okay, the freedom rides is about desegregation of facilities, particularly in interstate commerce. What's the other side? What do they want? Voter registration. Want to emphasize that. So why are these two things in conflict again?
Because if you sort of shift over to the voting rights, you sort of allow the other older groups to sort of capture the young movement, which was kind of the fear of like Ella Baker and leaders who sort of initiated this thing in the first place.
Okay, you have NAACP from the beginning saying voter registration. You have King from the beginning saying voter registration is key. Now, one thing about, this is before the 18-year-old vote. So most of these people involved in this movement can't vote. They can't even register people to vote. All they can do is just go out and ask people to register to vote. So for most of the students, this is kind of like, this is what the adults do. Go out and get people registered to vote. We want to go out and protest because that's what we can do. You put your body on the line. That's what students can uniquely do that NAACP has a difficult time doing. In fact, Martin Luther King has a difficult time doing. Does Martin Luther King engage in civil disobedience at this point? No. So the only people who are really doing Gandhian civil disobedience are the student activists. Now, given that, why even consider voter registration? Are there any advantages to it? If you're in SNCC, money. Okay, money becomes a factor because what does money do? Okay, it helps you run the organization. You have a small group, not very much money, but it does something else. If you're a student activist, what are you thinking about? Why do you need money? It's not going to pay your tuition, right?
Go out of jail.
Okay, get people out of jail, but what else can it do? I mean, look, if you're a member of SLAC on this campus, Student Labor Action Committee, okay, and you really get involved in wanting to do that, and you're leading a lot of successful protests, what do you want? What would be very useful for you?
More members.
Okay, more members, publicity, but what else? Yes.
I mean, are you working while this is going on? So shouldn't you get like a salary?
Hey, a salary. Okay, they've spoken like a true person who wants us to have a living. Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, this is like not just part-time activity. But you're beginning to think. If you're in the Freedom Ride, you're spending the summer of 1961 in a Mississippi jail. Probably as soon as you got out of school in the spring, you're off to the Freedom Ride. Well, a lot of students work during the summer to pay for their next year. So part of the question becomes, as you become more and more involved, someone like a Diane Nash, you're spending a huge amount of your time being an activist. And wouldn't it be nice to have at least a little bit of income to pay for that, to pay your expenses as you're doing that? So part of what happens is that you have this division about what you're going to do in terms of your time. Now, this happens at the local level. Some of these local protest groups, particularly in Nashville and Atlanta, form very strong local protest groups. They raise some money, and they actually have a staff. They begin to pay people to, not much, maybe $10 a week. Actually, that becomes the standard SNCC salary. $10 a week became very important because it provided enough for subsistence if you could find someone to live with, which means that you have to have local support or else you're going to starve because you can't rent a place for $10 a week. But if you can go someplace and have somebody put you up, in other words, you have some local support, $10 a week can do it. So they're drawn in two different directions. One of, they want to continue protest activity, but they know that the money that they're likely to get from, particularly from foundations, is going to go for voter registration. So that's the dilemma in the summer of 1961, and Ella Baker helps them get through this and basically says, look, you can do both. Don't tear yourself apart trying to decide whether SNCC is going to do one or the other. Do both. You decide. Some of you, if we get some of this voter registration money, what it's going to do is at the end of the summer, some of you can become full-time activists. And that's precisely what happens. Not a lot. First, maybe a dozen or so people. One of these people who start this is Bob Moses. Becomes one of the first SNCC workers. So that by the fall of 1961, the nature of the organization has changed. You have, it's no longer simply this coordinating committee that gets together, exchanges ideas. We're doing this in Greensboro. You're doing that in Nashville. Instead now, some key people from each of these local groups decide, I'm not going to go back to school in the fall. Some of them have graduated. Some of them, like Julian Bond, never graduated. Came within a semester or so of finishing up and just decided, look, this is what I want to do, and I'm not going back to school in the fall. So they become the first field staff, SNCC field secretaries. That's what they call them. Now they take that term from groups like the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Remember when Bayard Rustin is kind of a field organizer. Someone who goes out into various places, sent out by the organization, tries to mobilize local support. So Ella Baker helps them get to this point where you begin to see the emergence of a full-time student activist playing a role in the movement. Very, very small group, not a lot of money. How much does it cost to pay 12 people $10 a week? Not much. But actually one of the things that happens during the 1960s, sometimes they don't even get the $10 because they're so hard up for funds, they don't even get that. But by that time, they've kind of perfected a technique of organizing that relies a lot on grassroots support, going into communities, recognize that you need to have the support of a local organization, local leaders, and you need to work with them because, if you're living in somebody's house in the Delta of Mississippi and they disagree with what you're doing, they can always come home and say, hey, get out. This is not what we want to do here. So I think that if you look at the way SNCC develops, you can see that Ella Baker is putting forward an idea that also fits with the financial realities and with the history of the organization. And it helps to explain why SNCC developed a unique style of grassroots organizing. Now, Ella Baker, I'll just say a few more words about her subsequent career. She stays involved with SNCC during the early to mid 1960s, helps form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. Her connections are essential to SNCC because of her background. She's able to put SNCC in touch with many people outside the South. Many of SNCC's early supporters outside the South are through the Ella Baker connection. She's the one who kind of schools them on a lot of the history of the movement because after all, these are 18, 19, 20 years old kids who are not that familiar with what went on in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s. She's able to convey some of that history. And indeed, one of the things that you'll see in the In Struggle book is the way in which those in SNCC gradually become aware of the disputes between communist and anti-communist. The questions of the Cold War. Will SNCC accept help from the National Lawyers Guild? The National Lawyers Guild are leftist lawyers, some of them communist lawyers, who have helped the movement and want to help in 1964. Well, the NAACP basically says, look, you either accept your legal help from the NAACP or from the National Lawyers Guild, but you're not going to get it from both. And SNCC responds, well, if you want to walk, you can walk, but we'll let people know that we're not getting help from the NAACP. And so they basically call what turned out to be a bluff because the NAACP wasn't about to walk away from the work completely, at least all the work that SNCC was doing in Mississippi and Alabama. And that helped resolve this issue which had been stymieing the development of the civil rights struggle, this argument between over communism. From SNCC's point of view, we'll accept help from anyone who wants to offer it. And that became their position. Well, I think someone like an Ella Baker, who had been through many of those disputes, helped them to do that. Also, I think in terms of fundraising, she was key in terms of developing SNCC's unique style of fundraising, which was to send people involved in the movement around the country. And in fact, that's how someone like myself got involved, would be on your campus. You would have, this happened a lot at Stanford, someone who had been in the South, they would come back. Sometimes they would be from the campus, sometimes from other places. They might bring a Bob Moses. And they would come and stand in front of a class like this and tell about what the work that they were doing. And I can tell you from the experience I had, when you hear these stories, it sounds a lot more interesting than being a typical student. It sounds like something that you might want to do, and at least you might want to support. And they would raise money. And they would also do it through sending around a group called the Freedom Singers. Freedom Singers came to various campuses, Stanford and other campuses, UCLA, and they would come and they would introduce students to the songs of the movement. And they would use this for fundraising purposes, bringing it back in. So I think Ella Baker is one of these crucial individuals who never really had a leader position in any of the organizations she was in. She was always simply either a staff person, an advisor, an interim office manager, all of these various roles. But what she was, I think, basically was a catalyst. She was a person who, because of her presence, because of her understanding of the nature of organizing, she was the person who made it possible for other people to realize their potential for activism. And I think that's what, when we all got together in 1979 to celebrate her birthday, that's what we were celebrating, as a person who, over the course of time, was able to contribute to movements from the 1930s through the 1970s. Another thing I would say about her, just to conclude, would be that she was a long-distance runner. That one of the things I think about when I think about student activism is often there's a burnout syndrome, that a student kind of gets involved, gets really, it's kind of hard. It's physically taxing to kind of maintain political activism while you're still getting decent grades in your classes. And also, there's an enthusiasm and energy that goes into it that's hard to match and it's hard to sustain. So one of the questions that kind of guided my research in terms of people like Ella Baker, Ann Braden, Bayard Rustin, others, who had sustained their activism over a long period of time, is what allowed them to do this. And what's striking to me is the way in which they integrated their private and their political lives, so that it was hard to see the margins of where one left off and the other began. And I think that was definitely true of Ella Baker. She was an activist and organizer in her private life and her public life. She did it wherever she was, and so it didn't really matter what the arena was. She knew what her mission was, and that was to organize other people. I wanted to kind of give Clarence an opportunity to say a few words, because you knew certainly a number of these people, and I just wondered if you had any reflections about.
Oh, no, I think your very accurate description. I did not know. I mean, I knew Ella Baker, met her, did not know her well. I was on the other side of having to respond or react or hear the reaction Martin King and the people in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I think as I look back on it, is that you know, a lot of what happened is that Ella Baker was dealing with you know, Southern Baptist preachers, all of whom individually in their own right were kings in their respective church fiefdoms, you know, and so that that's what she was dealing. We would put it in classic terms, put it bluntly. She was dealing with a massive tidal wave, a wall of male chauvinism. Okay, respectively with the preachers, and that she effectively became like the godmother of SNCC. She became their you know, their conscience. She validated their irreverence. In other words, it was okay. It was okay to feel the way you feel, to want to be independent, and not and want to go and do your thing, because you know, the preachers, including Martin King, they have their agenda, and their agenda is more about dealing with voter registration, dealing with getting institutional money to support them, whereas Ella Baker and SNCC, to put it, I guess, in other more modern terms, is sort of like a guerrilla movement, you know, distinguished from a more formal army of the of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They were the young, extremely heroic. It was, in fact, it was the heroism and the courage of people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under Ella Baker's leadership that inspired the nation. That inspired. I mean, you know, people like Jim Foreman and Idaho Donaldson, and Ivanhoe Donaldson, and of course the super charismatic leader Bob Moses. You know, Bob Moses went to he could have done anything. Went to the high school, graduated high school, Bronx High School of Science, a math teacher, you know, and he was. I think Bob Moses and Ella Baker inspired Bob Moses. Okay, but Bob Moses also was sort of like this is the greatest compliment I could say. He was like Che Guevara. Okay, now, you may not agree about Che Guevara, but he was like, he had that kind of just total, pure, undiluted dedication to the struggle, and much of that came from Ella Baker. And it was interesting in what Clay was saying about the long distance runner. There was no separation between the movement in Ella Baker's life and her life. The movement was her life. That was what she did 24/7. That's, you know, it was not like she went to work, you know, and said, I'm going to do this from 9 to 5. That's what she did 24/7. And people began to respect her. And actually, there came a time when she was somewhat of a restraining force against a lot of the building up of the criticism that you get when SNCC people refer to Martin as the Lord. You know, you don't want to deal with the Lord. Okay. Bevel's great contribution is that he was thoroughly implanted and respected in both camps. He was respected by the adults, and he was respected by SNCC. And the common denominator of Bevel's respect, just like Bob and Moses' respect, and just like Ella Baker's respect, was the purity of his courage. Might have been a little crazy sometimes, might have been a little, but Bevel's commitment was like straight as an arrow. Had no, we all had fear, but he was he was a classic guerrilla leader.
I just want to say a couple of more words just in terms of Ella Baker's influence. There's so many people who are the products of her influence that don't even realize where these ideas come from. But one of the basic ideas that kind of became a slogan later is for organizers, our job is to work ourselves out of a job. And what was meant by that is something that I think you still see lots of evidence of that in the way in which, for example, teaching is done today. You know, that her point was that as an organizer or as a teacher, you never want to have people dependent upon you. That what the goal is to get them to be autonomous, to get them to understand their own potential. And if you can do that, when you leave, you have a standing movement. And the real criticism of King was that King could go into a community, and yes, he could get people to respond to his charisma, come out to meetings and all that kind of stuff. But the moment King left, everything falls apart because, where's the leaders? If we don't have King, we can't do anything. Rather than gaining confidence in the local leadership. And many of these ideas start with, they go back to the cooperative movement, to some of the ideas that she got out of her own experience. But certainly in the 1960s, Ella Baker is the fountain of that kind of understanding. Bob Moses popularizes it throughout the country because of his own role in Mississippi, so that a whole generation of young people took those ideas into so many different areas, not just education, but into the business world. I mean, if you go over to Stanford Business School, you don't learn organization and management the way you would have learned it in the 1960s. What is the emphasis? It's on group processes. It's on how do you create a situation where each person in an organization can make their maximum contribution rather than being put into a hierarchy where that contribution is limited. The idea of lecturing in a class as opposed to gaining interaction in the class. The idea of education being constructive, that you learn by doing. All of these kinds of things have influenced so many different areas of life. And I think that it's important to kind of understand that they didn't come out of the air. They really came out of the experiences of people. And again, I would say, no one went into a room. You'll never find Ella Baker's book on organizing. She never sat down and studied this and worked it all out. It was something that emerged out of a lifetime of experience. And I think it's still something that's kind of hard to capture. Bob Moses, similarly, he's never sat down and wrote out, this is how I organized Mississippi. It's just that people like myself, observing that process, trying to write about it and trying to understand what was the technique. And a lot of it was not theoretical, but came out of the necessity of knowing that you can't survive in the Delta of Mississippi unless you understand how to work with local people and how to respect their own leadership abilities. And you can't expect the movement to survive if you come into a situation and get everyone dependent on you being there. I'll say one final word about this. I remember a talk that Bob Moses did give, and a lot of times he would kind of give these little hints and about what his technique was, and someone asked him, like, what was the secret of your organizing technique? He thought about it for a while and he said, it was all about where to sit. And what he meant by that is, as an organizer, he would often sit at the back so that no one would be looking at him during the meeting. That way it would force people to look at the other people in the room. And often at a meeting, and I've been at meetings with him, he would say nothing. And the only questions and comments he would make would be facilitating, you know, like, okay, well, that's an interesting idea. How you want to do that? And allow the ideas to kind of develop from the people there, and then seeing his role as an organizer to facilitate whatever they want to do. Even if he as the organizer might think, well, you know, that might not be the best thing for them to do, but if they want to organize to get sidewalks in their community, as opposed to, you know, the kind of muddy streets that you get in Greenwood, Mississippi at that time, then that's important to them. And they will learn something from that process about how to get together and get something accomplished. And then you will have, as the result of that process, the emergence of one grassroots leader who the people can trust. In 1976, actually when this film Fundi was being made, Joanne Grant was the filmmaker, and I went around to some of those same places that she was going around, and Ella Baker was kind of with us. And we went to many of these places where Bob Moses had been the organizer. By that time, he had left the country and gone, and he was living in Tanzania with the idea of not coming back. And it was interesting to see. You'd go from one place, you'd go from Greenville to Hattiesburg, you know, all these different places in Mississippi, and you would see all these individuals, and they would ask about, you know, whatever happened to old Bob, you know, and they'd be all curious about. And then they would tell these stories about how Bob had kind of come in to their community and encourage them to become leaders. And of course, by 1976, many of these people were like elected officials, sheriffs of their local counties, on the school board. There are today more black elected officials in Mississippi than any other state in the nation. I don't know if you realize that. This is a state where black people couldn't vote when the movement began there. And now there are more black elected officials, most of them at the local level. So this is a fundamental change, and I think that we need to understand, how did this come about?
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.